Hello, good friends. This video fits into two of the series that I'm working on. It has its linguistic aspect, so it certainly goes in the collection of linguistic videos. But it's also about my own life, so it goes in the series about the most privileged person on earth. I was born and grew up mostly in Venezuela till I was 16 years old. Then I left and went to the US for college, and in 1970, when I was 20, I guess, we moved to Mexico, and since then I've only been back to Venezuela once, in 1973, for about 2 or 3 months. So all of this stuff that you're going to be seeing is memories from 50 years ago or more, pretty much. But it's been a real pleasure to visit in memory those places that I grew up in. I was having fun messing around with Google Earth, and I was struck by the names of the towns that are around. I mentioned in the other video that we could see a mountain we called the Wedding Cake Mountain from our front porch. And on the other side of that Wedding Cake Mountain, there's a little town called La Guanota. It never occurred to me when I was a kid to wonder what a guanota was. It was just La Guanota was over there. I found out since that a guanota is some kind of a bee, but in any case, just the sound of that name sounds so Venezuelan to me. Think of some of the other towns that are around. There's a town called Guanaguana. There's a town called Chaguaramal. There's a town called Huacarapo. There's a town called Maracao. There's two beach towns called Chichiriviche. There's two towns called Caicara de Maturin and Caicara de Orinoco. There's a town called Carúpano, another called Yaguaraparo, another one called Guiria. They all kind of have the same ring to them. And then if you go to Mexico, you're going to hit a whole bunch of towns with different sounding names. Mexico itself, Mexico, Tepoztlán, Huastepec, Atlatlauca, Chichicuautla, Tecocomulco, Tezontepec, and so forth. You might make a sort of a caricature, I suppose, that in Venezuela the names all sound sort of like they're Charahuama or something like that, and in Mexico they sound like Tlatzacotla or something. The difference, naturally, has to do with the indigenous languages that were found in these two places. In Venezuela it was Caribbean or Caribe kinds of languages, Taino, Chaima, and others. And the place names came from those languages, so they reflect the phonologies of those languages. Whereas in Mexico, even in the areas that aren't Nahuatl speaking, you get Nahuatl names because the Spaniards took with them, when they went to those places, their Tlaxcaltec allies. And the Tlaxcaltecos were Nahuatl speakers. So even down in the Zapotec and Mixtec and Mayan areas, clear down into Guatemala and other places in Central America, you will find names in Nahuatl, even though Nahuatl was not spoken there historically. But one way or another, it's Nahuatl whose phonology governs the place names in Mexico generally, and it's the Caribbean languages that govern the place names in Venezuela, naturally enough. The very sound, or you might almost say the smell of the words in the two countries are different. And that brought to mind several things that happened when I first went to Mexico. Two anecdotes stick out in my mind. One time I remember that I was having a problem with my car, which of course for me was a carro, but in Mexico they call it coche. And I was looking for people and I was asking them where I could find a bomba, because I had a caucho sin tripa, que está pinchado. And they would look at me like they couldn't understand what on earth. And I would say, well, you know, here's my carro, and you can look at the caucho and see that it's pinchado and I need to get it fixed. And they said, oh, you must be looking for a talachero. And I said, a talachero? I haven't any idea about that. I was looking for a bomba. Well, it turns out the bomba is called a gasolinera, not a bomba. And in Mexico, the talacheros don't always work at the gasolinera. A talachera is the person who fixes your tires. He has a talacheria. So what I wanted was a talacheria because I had a llanta, not a caucho, sin cámara, not sin tripa. This is a tubeless tire. And it was agujerado, it wasn't pinchado. Well, okay, I had to change just about every word in that little sentence to make it understandable in Mexico. The other thing I remember was going to a store in Cuautla, and I was looking around at the merchandise, and the guy that was attending says to me, can I help you? And I said, I'm just looking, nomás estoy mirando. And he says, ándale pues. And I thought, whoa, I left. I mean, if he's going to run me out, I'll go. Then I heard some other people saying it, and they sort of smiled when they said it. They looked kind rather than mean. I remember so well people saying even, ándile marchante. And it turns out that in the center of Mexico and in the Cuautla areas where I heard the most, ándale means, that's fine, go ahead. Whereas to me it sounded like, anda vete, get out of here. So it makes a difference where you come from, which versions of Spanish you're going to speak. In another video, I mentioned to you the fruits and delicious food that we had that grew in Caribe. I remember very well, must have been about 1957 or 58. My mom, bless her heart, was dealing with 6 or 7 of us kids by then, and she got really sick. She fell ill with rheumatic fever, in fact, and she thought she might be going to die. I've seen entries in her diary where she is saying to God, I can't do this anymore, and if it's your time to call me home, that's okay, but what's going to happen to these kids? So it was a difficult time for her. One of the tactics that she used was to make all of us take a nap in the afternoons, and she didn't worry too much if we were asleep or not, as long as we weren't bothering her, and that was fine. But I remember it well because we had a window that we could climb out of, and it led to a catuche tree. And I remember sitting in the branches of the catuche tree, eating catuche, spitting the seeds on the ground. It tasted so good, I can just taste it now thinking about it. When we went to Mexico, I remember thinking, hey, I'm going to find lots of food that I knew from Venezuela here. And I looked for catuche, but I couldn't find it. And then one day I saw it in the market. But there was a sign there that said, guanábana. Guanábana. Okay, turns out that guanábana is the name for the same thing that in Venezuela is called a catuche. In English, one of the names I guess it's given is a soursop. Well, it's just different. And the weird thing is that the name guanábana sounds like a Venezuelan name, but that's the one they have in Mexico, and the one in Venezuela is catuche, which doesn't sound un-Venezuelan, but it is surprising that guanábana is not the name for it in Venezuela. Anyhow, in both Venezuela and Mexico, we had chirimoyas, which look a lot like catuches, and they have the same name in both places. We had mangos, and those have the same name in both places, though I gotta say the mangos in Las Delicias were special. I never tasted better mangos than those. And when it was mango season, we'd spend weeks at a time up in the mango trees, eating to our heart's content, shaking the branches to make them fall. And a half a dozen times we found up the mango trees mapanare, which is a very poisonous snake, fer de lance I think they call it in English. And by God's grace, none of us was ever bitten by one of the animals, but they were kind of scary when you found them. Another thing I remember about the mangoes is that the head cook at the Bible Institute where we live used to pay us to gather the mangoes after we'd shaken them down. As I remember, she paid us a locha, which was the 1/8 part of a bolivar back in those days. Anyhow, we brought her so many mangoes that she lowered the price until it was a locha for 100 of them. A good lesson in market economics, I guess. It's really kind of an interesting thing that the mango is called the same thing both in Mexico and Venezuela, but it's a fruit that originally came from India, and it had made its way to the Philippines by the time of the Spanish discovery of the Americas and the East. And it seems very probable to me that the mango came along with a lot of other Eastern goods from Manila on the galleon that used to run every year between Manila and Acapulco. So then it would have come from the Philippines to western Mexico and then across to the Caribbean side of Mexico and from there to Venezuela. That may have happened. On the other hand, it may have come via the Portuguese, because the Portuguese were coming back and forth between Portugal and India on the other side of the globe. And they stopped off in Brazil, and that's why Brazil is Portuguese speaking. The Brazilians, however, call the mango a manga. And interestingly enough, in Venezuela we had a fruit very like a mango, but bigger and kind of blander. It never tasted as good as a mango, but we called it a manga also. There were lots of other things that were sort of the same and sort of different. In both Venezuela and Mexico, we ate corn, which we called maíz, but in Mexico, the corn would grow on a milpa, or in a milpa also. They called both the field and the corn plant a milpa. And it was, when it was corn on the cob, they'd call it a elote, and then when it was hard on the cob, they'd call it a mazorca, and then when you took the grain off the cob, they'd call it maíz finally. The thing that they used to take it off the cob is called an olotera, and that comes from the olote, which is the name of the cob. All of that stuff was kind of weird to me because in Venezuela it was just maíz. I mean, it was corn on the cob, you call it maíz tierno, and if it was maíz desgranado, you'd call it maíz desgranado, you'd call it shelled corn. But it was the same vegetable, more or less, or the same food. It's good food, but what they made out of it was different. In Venezuela we had empanadas and we had arepas and we had hallacas, and all those things are so good. And then when we got to Mexico, you couldn't get them. But you could get instead tortillas, and you could get tamales, and you could get good things like that. But it wasn't the same food. It was just a new kind of food that we had to learn to like. I remember the first time I went to Veracruz, and they have there what they call a tamal ranchero. And like the ayaca, it's wrapped in banana leaves and then steamed. And I thought, oh, I've got ayacas. And the first time I tried one, I thought, oh, no, it's a tamale, you can tell. The taste is different and all. And I love the tamales rancheros, but they're not ayacas. Another thing that I remember really well from my days in Venezuela, Dad used to take trips periodically down to the low country, to the llanos. And he'd buy whatever he'd gone down there to take care of, but he'd often bring back a pickup load and or a trailer load full of fruit. And the two that I remember that he would most often bring and that I just loved were pinas. My goodness, what good pinas we would get. And then other times he'd come back with a load of Battilla, and we loved that too. We would usually figure out a way to drop one or two of the Batillas as we were carrying them into the house, so we'd have to eat them before anything else happened, and Dad would laugh and let us do it. But in Mexico, nobody had ever heard of Battilla. They called it sandia, which to me sounds like Saint Day. Why would you call it Saint Day? Just a different name for it. Another thing, in Venezuela, in Las Delicias in particular, we had, I don't know, several dozen kinds of cambur. And besides the cambures, we had guineos and topochos. And we also had plátanos. Well, those are all names for different kinds of bananas. The plátano is the plantain, a cooking banana. But in Mexico, they were all called plátano. And that was different. It's actually a kind of a nice example how in one country or culture a certain kind of thing can be divided up into various groups and each one have its own name, whereas in a different culture they're all lumped together as one kind of thing and they only have one name for it. And Venezuela's word? Well, where does that one come from? It's a weird story. Years ago, we were teaching at a session of the Summer Institute of Linguistics at the University of North Dakota, and an exercise we gave to a group of students for their last week at the school was to turn them loose with a Turkish speaker or two and see how much Turkish they could learn in a week. It's a good exercise, by the way. And in the process of all of that, I was paging through a Turkish dictionary and I came across a little word kambur, which means hunchbacked. And I thought, whoa. Is that where the cambur that I knew as a child came from? Well, I didn't follow it up very well. It was harder in those days. But I have just recently now looked on that fountain of all wisdom, Wikipedia, and other sites on the internet, and found out that the word comes from the Guanche language, which was spoken in the Canary Islands before the Spaniards got there. Well, Guanche, it turns out, is a Berber language. That is, it was spoken in the northern part of Africa between the Sahara Desert and the Mediterranean Sea. Well, if they were in the Mediterranean area, maybe they got the word from the Turks. Could well be. Where did the Turks get the word? Well, surprisingly enough, they got it from the Greeks. A word that I knew from New Testament Greek was kampto, which means to bend. It's often used for bending the knee. It speaks of humility, actually. And kampulo means something that's bent. So the Turkish word, hunchbacked, is considered to have come from that. Well, what do you know? I would never have predicted that. I've got to say that the cambures in Las Delicias were the best I've ever had. They just had a special taste to them that no other bananas I've eaten have had. I sometimes wonder if the reason everything tastes so good in my memory is just nostalgia, or if they really were that much better. And I remember thinking that before I went to Venezuela in 1973 for the last visit we made. I'd been eating papaya in Mexico, and it was good, I liked it, but it somehow just didn't taste like the lechosa that we would eat in Las Delicias. So on that trip back to Venezuela, right near Las Delicias, I remember getting a lechosa and cutting it open and eating it and realizing, no, this is not just nostalgia. This is excellent lechosa. There were several kinds of fruit that we actually knew by the Mexican names. One of those would be aguacate. Aguacate comes from the Nahuatl word aguacat or avagat, and we called it an aguacate. It would have made sense that we might have called it a palta like they do in Peru, but we didn't. Another one that we got from Mexico, the name, is the tomate, the tomato. It would be tomat in Nahuatl. When I went to Mexico, I had to learn to distinguish between the tomate and the jitomate. And it turns out that the jitomate is another Nahuatl word, because xitomatl means a leaf tomato. And there are two kinds of tomatoes. There's the big red round one, and then there's a little green one that has kind of like a shell around it, but the shell looks like it's made out of leaves, and that's the xitomatl. Nevertheless, some places in Mexico, they run them backwards, and they call the big one the jitomate, and the little one they just call tomate or tomatillo. I mentioned how we would spend so much time in the mango trees. Another place where we'd spend a whole lot of time was in Nespero trees. Nesperos are called the same thing both in Venezuela and Mexico. In English, they're called sometimes Nespero, but often called loquats as well. They're very delicious fruit, but the trees that they grow in are a lot more dangerous than the mango trees. If you're up a mango tree and you step on a branch that's not big enough to hold you, it'll just bend a little bit and let you slide down to the next branch down the tree. Whereas with a Nespero tree, it's likely to break, and you could stick yourself really bad if you fall on the broken off piece. So we had to be a lot more careful when we're raiding the Nespero trees than when we were raiding the mango trees. Another thing that we had a lot of in Venezuela and never had at all in Mexico was cassava. Cassava is made from the manioc root, and they grind it up and squeeze the poison out of it and then make it into these big cakes that are sometimes dried up on a roof. And cassava is one thing I never learned to like very well in Venezuela. When it's just fresh, it's not too bad, but when it's dry, and we often had to eat it when it was several weeks old, dried, it's hard to take. Apparently, I wasn't the only one. There's a dicho in Venezuela, a falta de pan, cassava, which translates as, if there's no bread around, you eat cassava. Another thing, in Venezuela we had maní. I remember we'd go down to Puerto La Cruz or Barcelona, and these guys would walk around on the streets selling them, and they'd call out something like, maní, maní, maní tostado, which would mean toasted peanuts for sale. Well, I got to Mexico, and I found out there was no such thing as maní, but they did have cacahuate, which is the same thing, of course, but just a different name. And I thought, what a big old name, cacahuate, for something as simple as a maní. But again, we've got a Nahuatl word. It comes from cacavat, which means shell. It was applied to the peanuts when peanuts began to be imported to Mexico. Another thing that I remember really well from Venezuela is the flowering trees, particularly the bucares. Bucares are orange flowering trees, and they grow very tall, and they were used as shade trees around the Caribe area, particularly for coffee plantations. So there were a lot of bucares, and when they were in bloom, it was a beautiful thing. But even more beautiful than the bucare is a tree that grew down on the llanos. I don't think there's hardly anything that God has made that is more glorious than an araguané in full flower. It's Venezuela's national tree, and I think it was a good choice for that. Well, there's lots of other stuff that we could talk about. One thing we haven't mentioned at all is the names of animals, and there are some that are quite different between Venezuela and Mexico. Some of you may have seen Holly's video that she just made with her husband Ben and his mother Paloma about Mexican dichos, or phrases that are kind of half proverbs. And one of them is about the comal calling the olla black. Pot calling the kettle black, we would say in English. And a Venezuelan wrote in and said, well, the way to say that in Venezuela is that the cachicamo tells the morrocoy that he's conchudo, which means the armadillo tells the tortoise that he's shellbound. Shellbound is kind of an insult. You could also translate it, he's a jerk. Those are two names that are just so beautiful for a Venezuelan's heart to just hear the word cachicamo and just hear the word morrocoy. They're beautiful. Well, okay, what's all this good for? What can we learn from it? I'd like to mention some lessons that would be good for us to learn about linguistics from this kind of information. One of them is that when two languages come in contact, both of them tend to be affected. I can assure you that Nahuatl was affected by Spanish, but Spanish was affected by Nahuatl. And Spanish was also affected in Venezuela by the Caribbean languages, Taino and others. And that explains a fair bit of the differences between Venezuelan Spanish and Mexican Spanish. Dialectology is full of those kinds of issues where contact with another language has helped one dialect or one variant of a language change with respect to the other. On the other hand, it's not the kind of change that you can predict stuff. I think that nomenclature, or the naming of things, and just the lexicon in general, the list of words and the specific words and what they mean, is a really important part of linguistics. There have been linguists that looked down on lexicography, and the reason, some of them have said it explicitly, is that you can't predict anything. So how can it be science if you can't predict anything? If science means you have to predict, then I'd much rather understand what's going on and appreciate it, even if I can't predict it. And I can't predict the lexicon. It's the kingdom of the idiosyncratic, but it's important. And I think it would do linguists a lot of good if they had to take a while and work on a dictionary of some language that they don't know. It teaches you things. Besides just the experience of particularity that you get from making a dictionary, I guess, I think it's an admirable thing and a helpful thing if a linguist can actually have a taste for the particularities, a joy at the surprise. One of my favorite authors, G.K. Chesterton, says somewhere that the chief pleasure is surprise. And I think there's something to that. I'd like to read you a longer piece from Chesterton where he talks about the joy of particularity. This is what he says. I have said that stories of magic, he'd been talking about fairy tales, I've said that stories of magic alone can express my sense that life is not only a pleasure but a kind of an eccentric privilege. I may express this other feeling of cosmic coziness by allusion to another book always read in boyhood, Robinson Crusoe, which I read about this time and which owes its eternal vivacity to the fact that it celebrates the poetry of limits, nay, even the wild romance of prudence. Crusoe is a man on a small rock, with a few comforts just snatched from the sea. The best thing in the book is simply the list of things saved from the wreck. The greatest of poems is an inventory. Every kitchen tool becomes ideal because Crusoe might have dropped it into the sea. It is a good exercise in empty or ugly hours of the day to look at anything, the coal scuttle or the bookcase, and think how happy one could be to have brought it out of the sinking ship onto the solitary island. But it is a better exercise still to remember how all things have had this hairbreadth escape. Everything has been saved from a wreck. Every man has had one horrible adventure. As a hidden untimely birth he had not been, as infants that never see the light. Men spoke much in my boyhood of restricted or ruined men of genius, and it was common to say that many a man was a great might have been. To me, it is a more solid and startling fact that any man in the street is a great might not have been. But I really felt, the fancy may seem foolish, as if all the order and number of things were the romantic remnant of Crusoe's ship. That there were two sexes and one son was like the fact that there were two guns and one axe. It was poignantly urgent that none should be lost, but somehow it was rather fun that none could be added. The trees and the planets seemed like things saved from the wreck, and when I saw the Matterhorn, I was glad that it had not been overlooked in the confusion. I felt economical about the stars, as if they were sapphires. They are called so in Milton's Eden. I hoarded the hills. For the universe is a single jewel, and while it is a natural cant to talk of a jewel as peerless and priceless, of this jewel it is literally true. This cosmos is indeed without peer and without price, for there cannot be another one. I spoke in the other video of how admirable it is and how much pleasure it brings if we have the attitude of Guido, who rejoiced when he discovered Pythagoras' theorem and who rejoiced when he could share it with someone else and who just said, "How beautiful!" Well, I think it's just as much true that we will profit greatly, both as linguists and as people, if we can have the attitude towards all the particular things that have been given to us. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that wonderful? This was saved from the wreck. I want as a linguist to rejoice when I discover a general rule that covers lots of cases, but I also want to rejoice when I find idiosyncratic cases, cases that buck the trend, cases that don't follow my rules, cases that give me that joy of surprise that comes to those who make themselves small and look at the world in wonder. I hope I can preserve that attitude. What a surprise that Mexico should use the Carib words guanábana and papaya, and Venezuela should not. What a surprise that in the second place the Venezuelans should choose to refer to the milky sap of the tree instead of to the fruit. Who would have thought it? Who would ever have imagined that the word gambur would have such a history, to come from Greek to Turkish to somehow getting over to the Berber languages to getting to the Canary Islands and then coming with the Spaniards from the Canary Islands to the New World? You could never have predicted it. It's a surprise, and it's a beautiful surprise. I'll also say that having this attitude helps with having a descriptive and not a prescriptive linguistics. If you just admire what you see, well, you note it and write it down. And you're not telling it how it ought to be, you're appreciating how it is. And that's at the heart of the descriptive-prescriptive debate, I think. Another thing, then, you can't separate linguistics from anthropology very well. And again, this is especially true when you're dealing with the lexicon. Anytime you learn about what the words are and what they're used for, you're learning about the culture of the people that speak those words. And about my own life, what can I say? I was privileged to grow up in Venezuela and to eat those delicious foods and learn their funny names and enjoy them. And then I was privileged to go to Mexico and learn to enjoy and love the foods and the names there and rejoice in the differences. So that multicultural inheritance that I have, the experience of living in several cultures and absorbing parts of them, that's enriched me greatly. I am a very, very privileged man.